we'll go ahead and get started. And welcome everyone. My name is Teresa Hanley, and I am representing the Mission Inn Foundation. And tonight we are partnering with the Riverside Public Library for Humanities Hour. These are programs funded by California Humanities with COVID relief funds. The Mission Inn Foundation is a nonprofit organization in downtown Riverside, which operates the Mission Inn Museum and does other public programming associated with the Mission Inn, which is a National Historic Landmark in our community. We will have tonight's presentation, Votes for Women March for Peace, and the foundation will also be presenting 2 other Humanities Hour programs, and one will be November 4th, which will be Barbara Burns on Alice Miller Richardson, and I'm not sure what the other one is, but look at the library's website or the Mission Inn Foundation's website to see those. So before I get started with a more formal introduction, I just want to do a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. So when you toggle over your toolbar, you'll notice we have disabled your cameras and muted your mics so that the quality of the presentation is stronger for everyone. You can ask questions through the question and answer, the Q&A function. We have also disabled the chat function just so that we can channel all of the questions and comments through the Q&A. So feel free to ask any questions or put any comments into the Q&A section. Joan and I will be monitoring that as the program goes on, as will our tech manager, Jared Hoagland, who is the Mission Inn Foundation's executive director in the background with us today. Thank you, Jared. So, as I said, my name is Teresa Hanley, and I'm the project director for the Mission Inn Foundation's multifaceted project called Toward Peace. As I mentioned, the Mission Inn is a National Historic Landmark in Riverside, and our foundation, our nonprofit organization, operates a museum and also the public tours of the Mission Inn, and does other public programming about the history of the hotel. Toward Peace is focused around the peace activism of Mission Inn founder Frank Miller, primarily in the the years before World War I. And so there are connections between that and the history of women's suffrage. So that's what our program is focused around tonight. Joan Donahue is with us. You see her on the screen. She's president of the League of Women Voters of Riverside. And she's going to start off with a presentation on the history of women's suffrage, culminating in the 19th Amendment. And then after she speaks, I'll talk a little bit about the connections between the suffrage movements and those pre-World War I peace movements and Frank Miller and the Mission Inn. And then we'll have questions at the end. So as you go along, as we go along, please feel free to type your questions in as they occur to you. We'll be able to monitor them and address them all towards the end. And then I did want to make one technical comment. When we start the slides, frequently there'll be the little pictures. Sometimes they appear on the top, sometimes on the right of the speakers. And you can make those disappear from your screen. When you toggle over those at the top, you'll see a little black bar, and there's 3 options. If you choose the single line, it should minimize those pictures, and you'll be able to see the full slide on your screen. So sometimes that's pretty disorienting for people. So give that a try if you're finding that our pictures are sometimes they overlap the images that the presenter has put on the screen. So with that, I would like to welcome Joan Donahue to tell us about the history of women's suffrage.
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here. So let's get set up first. Okay, and you see the little pictures. There's me and Teresa. So it's the little minus sign up at the top. And let's do this. Try again. There we go. All right. The history of women's suffrage is history at its best. Dramatic, surprising, joyous, and sad. Yet ultimately, the determination of the suffragists make it one of the most inspiring stories in American history. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in a small Methodist chapel in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Its goal was to draft a woman's Declaration of Independence. And in 1848, the attendees had their work cut out for them. As second-class citizens, women had no rights to own property, no access to education, no rights to the custody of their children, no rights to the safety of their own bodies. Spousal abuse was legal in some states. Women were so confined by law and custom, just the suggestion of women's rights was considered blasphemy. The organizer of the convention was 32-year-old Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who'd been a revolutionary all her life, fighting for every advantage afforded to her brothers. At the 1848 convention, the group of 300 women and men, largely abolitionists, passed one resolution after another in support of women's rights. Then Stanton demanded a resolution on women's right to vote, and she created an uproar. Stanton said, "Nothing short of this right will secure the rights of all others." It was a radical idea. What was at stake wasn't just the right to vote, but a whole system of customs that defined men and women's roles in the world. Arguments went on for hours until abolitionist Frederick Douglass rose in support. His words convinced those assembled that a true democracy demanded men and women, black and white, standing united for a better nation. Reaction to the convention's resolution in favor of women's suffrage was mostly negative, but it launched a wave of suffrage meetings that would expand in size and location for the next 70 years. One attendee at an early meeting was a restless school teacher from Rochester, New York. Excuse me, a young Quaker, Susan B. Anthony. She was a powerful speaker, statuesque with a commanding voice that was always dignified and concise. She took a simple message from coast to coast. Women must have full rights of citizenship, most basically to be treated like human beings. Stanton was divided between raising a family and raising a revolution. Stanton stayed home and raised 6 children. She wrote speeches and published articles while Anthony became the face of the movement. For 10 years, leaders of the suffragists had worked with abolitionist leaders like Sojourner Truth. When the Civil War erupted, suffrage leaders saw the promise of independence not just for Black men, but for women as well. When the war was over, Stanton and Anthony refused to support the 15th Amendment because it did not include voting rights for women. Abolitionists condemned Stanton and Anthony as radicals, even racists. Defiantly, Stanton and Anthony founded a new organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1872, suffragists challenged the Constitution. On election day, Susan B. Anthony went to the polls and convinced a young male poll worker to let her vote. Later that day, she was arrested at her home for the crime of voting. She insisted on being taken away in handcuffs. The trial itself was a sham. On the first day, the judge entered the courtroom with his guilty verdict written out and in his pocket. Eventually, the all-male jury agreed with his verdict. Anthony was declared guilty and fined $100. But the judge made one big mistake. He asked the accused if she had anything to say before sentencing. To the delight of the media, Anthony gave the court an earful and went on to demand women's right to vote under the Constitution as citizens of the United States. A year later, the Supreme Court ruled that while the Constitution considered women to be citizens, only states could define their right to vote. Anthony said, "We must buckle on our armor and battle for women's rights wherever the battle is to be fought." With Stanton's advice, Anthony began campaigning from Maine to California, educating, organizing, and energizing women. After 40 years of campaigning, only one state, Wyoming, entered the Union as a suffrage state. While most men resisted giving women the right to vote, the realities of frontier life put men and women on more equal footing. If there was any hope at all for women's suffrage, it appeared to be in the West. Suffragists in Western states needed organizers, speakers, and literature. The National Women's Suffrage Association sent a tough 35-year-old Iowan, Carrie Chapman Catt. She was the movement's best organizer and a thrilling orator. She famously rode a railroad handcart down a mountain in Colorado in order to make it to a meeting at the bottom of the mountain on time. She said, "Somehow I arrived, hatless and breathless and ready to give my speech." 20 years later, this fearless and determined woman founded my organization, the League of Women Voters. Organizers like Catt encourage Western suffragists to focus on specific groups. Laborers, farmers, miners, church organizations form coalitions with the classic political bargain, you help us, we'll help you. One of the most powerful partners was the Women's Temperance Union. Horrified by the abuse suffered by women and children at the hands of drunken men, the group's eventual goal was to outlaw the sale of alcohol. So the Temperance Partnership would also enlist one of the movement's strongest opponents, tavern owners, and the vast scope and power of the liquor industry. In 1910, California suffragists employed the same methods as organizers in other states, and they were creative. They traveled in convertibles and spoke from cars. They created postcards, playing cards, and shopping bags. They had organizers in every part of California. Maria de Lopez served as a Spanish translator for the movement and was the first woman to give a speech in Spanish in support of women's suffrage. But the tavern owners in the coastal cities were successfully campaigning against California suffrage. Proposition 4 was on California's ballot in 1911, granting California's women the right to vote. The proposition passed, but only because inland counties like Riverside supported suffrage. The opposition to suffrage nationwide was as stubborn as ever. The anti-suffrage women were society ladies. They believed their ability to shape the world rested in their identities as women. Women were the guardians of morals and civility and should not be corrupted by the unseemly world of politics. The anti-suffragists became a well-financed national organization and would oppose suffrage to the end. "It's too bad," Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, "that these women are begging to be left in their chains." At the end of the century, a new group of suffragists emerged, African American club women. They were an elite group, educated and middle class. These women argued that Black women needed the vote more than white women, because without it, they would be continually discriminated against. Mary Church Terrell was the outspoken leader of the African American Women's Club movement. She was an educator and reformer, and one of the few African American suffragists that Susan B. Anthony allowed to speak at events. Terrell pleaded with the white suffragists to include the injustices against Black women in their list of resolutions. But Terrell's plea found little support. Suffrage leaders were focused on wooing Southern white members and found it best to abandon their Black sisters. The club women did not give up. With the active support of African American men, they built a movement that would grow to 500,000, but they would never find acceptance among mainstream suffragists. At the turn of the century, profound change was coming to women's lives. Women were granted the rights to education, property, ownership, and custody of their children. Greater numbers were in the labor force and actively participating in progressive labor and social reforms. But the suffrage movement was in a rut. Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed away in 1902. Anthony followed 4 years later. The movement needed new, more modern methods if it was to move forward. The answer came from Harriet Blatch, one of Stanton's daughters and a dedicated socialist. She advocated open-air tactics, take it to the streets, talk to people one-on-one. Better yet, hold a parade. Parades turned out to be a powerful tool, not only demonstrating the size and dedication of the suffrage movement, but also convinced men that women were well organized, strategic, not frivolous or weak. But as awareness and support grew, so did opposition. Years of progressive reform had brought more men to the suffrage camp, but attitudes among most men had never really changed. Men were fearful, and they had good reason. Suffrage was a redefinition of roles of men and women. Men could see their identity changing, and it was a frightening thing. Factory owners, who did not want to improve wages or working conditions for women, saw an opportunity to play on men's fears and began spending money on anti-suffrage propaganda. However, the tide was turning in London. The British suffragists had adopted militant civil disobedience, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, whose motto was deeds, not words. On the scene was Alice Paul, a 22-year-old scholarly Quaker from New Jersey. Paul was wholeheartedly swept into the movement. She was arrested 3 times and suffered harsh prison terms. She joined other prisoners in a hunger strike and was fed by force. She wrote to her mother that she was tied to a chair because she struggled as doctors forced a tube 5 foot long through her nose. One of the results of torture is radicalization. Alice Paul was radicalized. At the age of 28, she would return to the United States and revolutionize the American suffrage campaign. In 1913, Alice Paul and her colleague Lucy Barnes staged a glorious pageant in Washington, D.C., right down Pennsylvania Avenue, one day before Woodrow Wilson was sworn in as president. The theme was to suggest free woman of the future, emphasize women's contributions to society. It was to be a moving, beautiful spectacle with Washington, D.C. as the backdrop. Some 8,000 suffragists participated, delegations of every kind, progressive men, Black women, everyone from coast to coast. As the parade progressed, some men began heckling on the sidewalks. They rushed the street, creating a melee of marchers and angry observers. One marcher asked a policeman for help and was told, "Nothing would have happened if you'd stayed home." The U.S. cavalry was called in to restore order. Not a single rioter was arrested. The riot received nationwide attention. Alice Paul took advantage of the negative press the rioters received and began an organized effort to lobby Congress for women's suffrage. 1 month later, crowds gathered outside the Capitol as a Western senator and congressman introduced a constitutional amendment declaring the right to vote shall not be denied on account of sex. Alice Paul named it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. In 1916, shifts in the political winds equaled hope for the suffrage movement. Jeannette Rankin was elected to Congress in Montana. President Wilson announced he would support suffrage, but only by state action. Carrie Chapman Catt became president of the National Suffrage Association. At 57, she was a seasoned and skillful leader, determined to organize and unite the suffrage troops in a military fashion. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Catt advocated that suffragists should both support the war effort and continue to lobby for suffrage. For Alice Paul, there was only one goal: women's suffrage. Her plan enlisted a perpetual delegation of picketers around the White House 6 days a week. Initially, they were to remain dignified and silent, but militants escalated the campaign. Banners mocked the president, calling out Kaiser Wilson, who valued freedom for foreigners over freedom for American women. Carrie Chapman Catt and the National Suffrage Association were horrified by the pickets. But worse, the picketers incited violence in some men who found the demonstrations un-American, subversive, even treasonous. As local law enforcement looked the other way, the women were frequently attacked, attacks that made front page news. President Wilson decided the women had to go. During the summer and fall of 1917, women began being arrested, charged with obstructing traffic. One group of women would be arrested only to be replaced by another group that would be arrested as well. Women of all ages were sent to prison for weeks or months. They weren't allowed mail or visitors. Many were at hard labor from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Prisoners reported being fed food with worms, insects, and rotting horse meat. It did not break their spirit. Many returned to the picket lines and were arrested over and over. Alice Paul was arrested and sentenced to 7 months. In solitary confinement, she went on a hunger strike and was fed by force 3 times a day. 30 prisoners joined her in the strike. They were forced to lie on stone floors, some very ill with high fevers. Authorities only increased their brutality until the women's treatment reached the outside world. The publicity was pervasive, and angry mail began pouring into Congress. Once again, the power of public opinion caused authorities to give in. All prisoners were released. In all, 168 women were arrested and tortured for silently picketing the White House. Now, in the fall of 1917, the power of public opinion was on the suffragist side. Politicians were well aware of the increased public support for suffrage and the big increase in women voters from states like New York that had recently passed suffrage. The House of Representatives scheduled a vote on the Susan B. Anthony Amendment for January 10th, 1918. The dedication of some men to this cause must not be overlooked. On the day of the vote, 3 congressmen left sick beds to vote for suffrage. 1 was carried in on a stretcher. A 4th left his wife's deathbed to vote. That congressman cast his vote and left the House floor to go to the funeral home. The 2/3 majority passed, but by just 1 vote. If just one of those men had not shown up to vote, the amendment would have failed. The amendment passed the Senate in June 1919, again by just 1 vote. But next, the biggest fight of all. 36 legislatures now had to ratify the amendment. Each time a state would ratify, Alice Paul sewed a star on her victory banner. By March 1920, she had 35 stars. The movement was forced to turn to the South and the state of Tennessee. The quiet town of Nashville became ground zero for an all-out political battle. One suffragist said that just because you had a legislator's vote in the morning didn't mean you'd still have it by nightfall. Suffragists were sure legislators were being bribed by factory owners and liquor interests as they saw their support slip away. Having kept careful tally throughout, suffragists went to bed the night before the vote feeling certain that they would lose by 1 vote. Harry Byrne, 24 years old and youngest member of the legislature, always wore a red rose in his lapel, a signal that he was anti-suffrage. When Byrne voted yes, he sent shockwaves through the State House. It took the suffragists a few moments to realize that his vote had broken a tie and passed the amendment. Everyone assumed Harry Byrne must have been bribed in some way. But no, he'd gotten a letter from his mother, which he carried in his pocket. She told him to be a good boy, help Mrs. Catt, and vote for women's suffrage. So the struggle for suffrage came to an end in part because a young man from Mouse Creek, Tennessee, did what his mother asked him to do. 20 million American women had won the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt wrote, "The vote is won. For 72 years, the battle for this privilege has been waged, but human affairs and their eternal change move on without pause. Progress is calling you. Make no pause. Act." And this is progress. Here we are 100 years later, where women not only cast ballots, but see their names on the top of them. Let's celebrate the women who fought for us, for our right to vote, by making sure we exercise it on November 3rd. Thank you very much. And Teresa?
Yes, I'm here.
All right.
Thank you, Joan. That was inspirational. So, I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, you can enter those into the Q&A function, and Joan and I will try to address those at the end. So I'm going to try to bring up my PowerPoint now. Here we go. So as I alluded to at the beginning, there are connections between the suffrage movement and the peace movement, primarily individual suffragists who were also very active in the suffrage movements. I'm going to kind of go over those with you as I go through the presentation. The one thing I do want to start with, just in case there are those here who aren't familiar with the Mission Inn, this is an older picture of it from 1950 or so, but you can see that it occupies the entire block between Main Street and Orange Street and 6th and 7th Street. The oldest section is this U-shaped section right here, which we call the Mission Wing. That was the first major addition. The hotel itself actually began as the Miller family home. They began taking in boarders, and the hotel grew throughout the late 1880s and 1890s. And then Miller's first big addition was this U-shaped section in 1903. So I think that's all I'll say about that. I do want to show you that there are other monuments in Riverside that discuss are monuments to Frank Miller's interest in peace. And among the reasons why we have a kind of continuing community memory of Frank Miller and peace. When we look up at Mount Rubidoux, we usually see the Mount Rubidoux cross, but sometimes we also see the tower here. I've seen people refer to it as a watchtower, but it is actually the Peace and Friendship Tower. It was funded and built by friends of Frank Miller, and dedicated in 1925. I love this phrase, in recognition of his constant labor in the promotion of civic beauty, community righteousness, and world peace. The Mission Inn is a National Historic Landmark, as I've said before, and that first edition in the Mission Revival style really began a lifelong effort by Miller. He really spent the rest of his life building the Mission Inn. And most of the time we think about Frank Miller as a businessman, a hotel man, as a entrepreneur, a sort of Southern California booster. But he was also very dedicated to what I'll call multicultural understanding and to peace. So here we see Frank Miller and his sister Alice on the right. These are both paintings by an Armenian American artist by the name of Hovsep Pushman. And Alice there was actually the hotel manager. And on the 4th, you'll hear more about her from Barbara Burns if you come back to the Library's Humanities Hour. I'm going to kind of let her be our connection back to suffrage, because as it happens, she married a man named Frank Richardson, who was a cousin of Susan B. Anthony. So here is Susan B. Anthony. Later in her life, you saw some great pictures of her as a younger woman in Joan's presentation. The woman with her is Anna Howard Shaw. So Anna Howard Shaw would have been the second leader of the suffrage movement after Susan B. Anthony's death. So Anthony and Shaw were on a trip to the West Coast in the summer of 1895. Anthony spoke in San Francisco at the Women's Congress Auxiliary at the California Midwinter Exposition, and the two then visited Yosemite and traveled to Los Angeles for more speaking engagements. They then came to Riverside, where Richardsons hosted a reception for them at the Glenwood Hotel. So this is before what we know as any of the additions that we know as the Mission Inn were built, still being called the Glenwood Hotel. In the evening, both Anthony and Shaw spoke at the Loring Opera House. Joan Hall, in her book on famous visitors to the Mission Inn, has a very nice vignette of the visit. Frank Miller himself was apparently not in favor of women's suffrage at the time, although he later admitted that he had been wrong. But especially with regard to his work in peace activism, he was in contact with women who were international leaders in both suffrage and peace. So let's catch up a little bit to the story of the peace movements. And while we're doing that, the photos I'm showing you on the left are Frank Miller's daughter, Alice Miller. Sister Alice was A-L-I-C-E, daughter Alice, A-L-L-I-S. This is a painting from about 1910. On the right is a really fascinating woman by the name of Aletta Jacobs. And we're going to learn about how she enters the Mission Inn picture in a minute. But let me just tell you a little bit about the peace movements at the time. So at about the turn of the century, from the 1880s on, national, international groups were holding various gatherings, and words like pacifism or pacifists began to gain some usage. By 1899, what would be known as the First Hague Peace Conference was held in the Netherlands. This is a gathering which established the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the historic predecessor to the United Nations International Court of Justice. A second conference was held in 1907. Its official gatherings were less productive than the previous meeting. One important element, though, is that by 1907, international peace activists, journalists, academics, religious leaders, and social reformers converged on the conference site at The Hague. Nearly every evening, these activists held parallel side meetings discussing their own ideas about peace, as well as critiquing the formal diplomatic events of the conference. Amazingly, Frank Miller of Mission Inn attended one of these sessions where he heard a talk by a noted peace activist and journalist, W.T. Stead. So how did Miller manage to attend this meeting? Well, it was through his friendship with Aletta Jacobs, the woman you see on the right. She was the first woman to be educated, trained, and to practice as a physician in the Netherlands. The Millers had met her a few years before, in November of 1904. At that time, Jacobs and her husband, C.V. Gerritsen, were in the United States to participate in a meeting of the Interparliamentary Union, an international NGO, at the St. Louis World's Fair. Following the meeting, the international delegates traveled and toured the United States on a government-organized tour. The Jacobs Gerritsen left the group in Denver and traveled on their own further west, visiting Riverside and staying at the Mission Inn in November of 1904. At that time, Miller's young daughter, Alice, was on a year-long study tour in Europe, and the next summer, when the study tour had finished, Alice visited with Jacobs in Amsterdam. So her parents and the Jacobs had arranged for Alice to go to Amsterdam and visit with Jacobs that summer. This would have been in 1905. A few years later, in 1907, Miller, his wife, Isabella, and Alice, the daughter, were in the midst of the family trip to Europe. In local history, we've tended to look at this 1907 trip in terms of how it affected Miller's ideas about future additions to the hotel and his collection. Lost in these oft-told tales, however, has been their visit to Amsterdam, where they spent several days with Jacobs. By this time, Jacobs had essentially retired from her work as a physician and spent most of her time working on behalf of suffrage, both the Dutch National Group and with the International Women's Suffrage Association, and as a peace activist. And I'll just say that one of the things that Jacobs is known for is that later she and Carrie Chapman Catt did a world tour traveling in the East and in India, I think, on behalf of international women's suffrage. And there's some wonderful correspondence about the adventures of the two of them. So now, though, I want to talk just a bit more about this meeting that was going on in 1907. So as I said, they were with Jacobs, and she's the reason that they were able to visit, the Millers were able to attend this conference of sort of, I don't know that I would call them agitators exactly, but they were all very vociferous peace activists, and W.T. Steed in particular was a journalist who was known for very sensational kind of journalism. One of the things that he was responsible for at the conference was this daily newspaper, the Courrier de la Conférence. He was a newspaper man, and so he published this account of daily activities at the conference and saw that it was distributed to the conference attendees as well as others. But as I said, each evening Steed would hold this gathering where there would be lively discussions about various peace topics. One of the people who was in attendance was another great suffragist. This is Fanny Garrison Viard. She was there as president of the International Council of Women. And as it happens, her correspondence with her predecessor with that group, a woman named May Wright Sewell, formed some of the most important documentation of the character of these meetings. And you see also from Alice, this is from Alice Miller's travel diary there at the bottom, where she describes the fact that Jacobs took them to this meeting. And she calls it a circle which deals with international affairs, very close to its actual name in French, Le Cercle International. And Alice tells us that Dr. Jacobs is a member and so could take us, very select and many bigwigs. So the point I kind of want to emphasize here is that the Millers are on what is essentially, a tourism visit. They're visiting all the usual historic sites and art museums, but they visit their friend Aletta Jacobs and find themselves among some of the most vociferous and lively discussions of peace going on at the time. The Millers then returned to Riverside, and in 1911, Frank Miller hosted what would become several of peace events at his Mission Inn. This was in February of 1911. And among the attendees at that gathering were Ida Tarbell, the crusading journalist, David Starr Jordan, president of Stanford University, and John Burroughs, the nature writer. So now I want to transition a little bit to talk about the connections between suffrage and activism and peace activism, particularly where women are concerned. So up in the upper left-hand corner, you see there an image that Joan also used, the official program for the 1913 suffrage march. What I want to emphasize here is that in these years, the organized peace movement was a little docile. I can't remember I think Joan said that the suffrage movement was kind of in a rut until a new generation came along, and something might be said about the peace movements as well. The peace movements in particular were also very male dominated, and they were very institutional and organizational in nature. The leaders tended to be businessmen like Andrew Carnegie, also a number of religious leaders, academics, college presidents. You'll see attending many of the peace meetings that were being held at the time. And so as Joan discussed with Alice Paul, the decade of the 1910s, the suffrage movement was moving to more direct street action, culminating in this 1913 march, which, as she pointed out, happened just the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And then here's a slightly different image from the one that she showed, where you can see them with the Capitol in the back. So again, this is in 1913. And then the summer, the very next summer, August of 1914, Europe, war erupted in Europe. So in those early days of the war, um, women, mostly suffragists, really catalyzed the peace movement, and almost in one afternoon, turning the tactics that they had been using in the suffrage movement to the cause of peace. So this, if you don't look closely, this might seem like a suffrage parade, but this is the silent peace parade. This was an event that was held August 29th of 1914. This is nearly 1,500 women engaged in a silent march down Fifth Avenue. At the front of the parade was Fanny Garrison Viard, and who we last heard of at the 1907 Hague Peace Conference. As you see, there's the organizers forbade any kind of national flag or emblem in this parade. The only banners or flags were the peace flag, peace banner that you see there at the front. And this event gathered enormous press across the nation, including accounts in the Riverside Daily Press, and it had immediate reverberations across the country. Similar marches were planned, including one for Los Angeles on September 24th. And Frank Miller was paying close attention. So again, that Women's March was August 29th. There was to be a gathering in Los Angeles on September 24th. And so Frank Miller moved quickly, convening local community leaders, including the mayor, interdenominational clergy, and other business and civic leaders to plan how to turn a previously planned Sunday song service to be held at Fairmount Park into a peace gathering. The event was held at the bandstand on Sunday, September 20th. It featured nationally known social gospel minister Washington Gladden, who spoke on the awful crime of war. The gathered crowd, estimated at several thousand people by the Riverside Daily Press, adopted a series of resolutions. I've kind of included the overview there for you. And it also selected a group of people to represent Riverside at the Los Angeles parade on the 24th. Frank Miller was one of those, and also just to refer back to Joan's presentation, another woman who was very active in social affairs, a woman named Stella Irvine, a Riverside resident who was a national leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and a suffragist. So the following year, in 1915, women continued to work for peace, first with a gathering in Washington, D.C., which culminated in the founding of the Women's Peace Party. By April, women were gathering at The Hague at the suggestion of Frank Miller's old friend, Aletta Jacobs. And let me just, I'm going to kind of show you. Here is Aletta Jacobs right here. So here again, we see the connections between suffrage and peace. International suffragists had been scheduled to hold their 1915 meeting in Berlin. So when the war broke out the previous summer, that meeting had to be canceled. Following up on a suggestion by Crystal Macmillan, a British suffragist and peace activist, Aletta Jacobs invited suffragists and other women dedicated to peace to gather at The Hague. Jane Addams, the American social reformer, was selected to chair the meeting. And here is Jane Addams right here. Over 1,500 women gathered from neutral and belligerent nations. Most British advocates were prevented from traveling by the British government. This is the occasion when Churchill, who was then a top naval official, referred to them all as those dangerous women. The meeting's agenda followed usual turn of the century conference plan with speeches and gatherings. However, near its end, the Hungarian activist Rosika Schwimmer suggested the delegates approach world leaders directly. Here's Rosika Schwimmer right here. Consequently, following the meeting, Addams and Jacobs embarked on meetings with European leaders. This meeting at The Hague is considered to be the birth of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, an international peace organization that still exists. And for us, it symbolizes a period of citizen activism around the world. In the United States, this manifested itself as efforts to get the United States to play an active role as a neutral mediator to bring about an end to the war. And this effort was popular enough for Wilson to run for re-election in 1916 on a slogan of "He kept us out of the war." So here, I guess remember that these are also the years when suffragists are marching. I think Joan said 1917 was the year that the women were in front of the White House. And the various arrests, force feedings, and so on began, as well as the change in public sentiment that required Wilson to change his stance on suffrage. And so what was happening in Riverside, when we last saw Frank Miller, he was holding that event in Fairmount Park in the autumn of 1914. And then throughout the early months of 1915, he hosted several peace advocates in Riverside. They usually stayed at the Mission Inn and spoke at the Congregational Church. And then in May of 1915, just days before the Lusitania or after the Lusitania was torpedoed, this long-planned Peace Day in California schools occurred throughout the state. And here we see a program for the Peace Day in the schools and this peace flag on the front of it. So, and then the photograph on the right is of a framed peace flag that is in the Mission Inn collections. This design was commissioned by Miller, and he dedicated funding to try to place one of these peace flags in every school in California. So as I said, this Peace Day occurred just a few days after the sinking of the Lusitania, an event that is usually thought of as the turning point in terms of popular public opinion on whether or not the U.S. should enter the war. And public opinion began to turn from isolation to preparedness, which was a euphemism for gearing up for the war. And during these months in 1916, what historian Michael Kazin has called a war against war was being waged among the various peace activists. Among the most vociferous of these peace organizations was a group called the American Union Against Militarism. And I want to talk just a bit about one of its members. This is a woman named Zona Gale.
Teresa?
Yes?
I apologize. We're going to have Zoom technical difficulties here. Unfortunately, we have to end this session in about 5 minutes.
Okay. So the Zona Gale, as you see there, is mostly known by us as Frank Miller's biographer, but she was also a novelist and a Pulitzer Prize winner. And quickly, what I'll do is just point out that here she is on the executive committee, and some of the other members. We see Jane Addams there, Lillian Wald, who was also a social reformer. I've called out some of the names. Max Eastman was the publisher of the radical magazine, The Masses. Amos Pinchot, for those who are Westerners, that's Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the Bureau of Land Management's brother, and Stephen Wise, who was a nationally recognized rabbi, were all members of this American Union Against Militarism. So they were actively lobbying in Washington, D.C. against U.S. involvement in the war. So now, as we know, despite these efforts, the United States did enter the war. Miller kept his disappointments to himself and turned his energies to bond drives, occasional public comments in support of the troops, and at war's end donated land for the municipal auditorium as a soldier's memorial. closer to home, he held in February of 1919, he hosted a dinner to honor mission and employees who had served in the war. And this is a locally made quilt in the Mission Inn collections that was probably made about this time. And up here is where you at the top is where the World War 1918, our Mission Inn heroes. So why don't we end there and we can see if if we have any questions. I don't see any open questions.